So continuing with our October-November 17 variant 2 paper 21, to combat a rising crime rate. So rising crime rate, the government decides to recruit additional police officers who are paid a wage equal to that which they previously earned in the private sector. So the wage that they're paid is the same. As long as their previous jobs remain unfilled, what effect will the recruitment of the additional police officers have on the national income and on economic welfare? So I believe national income should remain unchanged, right? Because they're getting paid the same before, they're getting paid the same now. So as per the expenditure method of calculating national income, there it should be unchanged.
I agree.
So we can say this. Now, if you look at economic welfare, then now that's interesting. Well, economic welfare only has two options. One, it decreases, or one, it is three, unchanged, decreases, or uncertain. So do we even know what these police officers were doing in the private sector? They were probably still some sort of security personnel there as well, right? Or I don't know. Maybe that's why we can say the economic welfare is uncertain change in economic welfare, because, well, there is a positive welfare definitely for them being police officers, but we don't know what they were doing in the private sector. Maybe they were like charity workers. I don't know, but we don't know whether this increase in economic welfare necessarily offsets or satisfies that economic welfare that they were adding to the society in their previous job. We don't know that. So can we agree on D?
questions का answer हमेशा.
Okay, and then Sharia is, and if you're into rattas, you can just say uncertainty hota hai. Okay, nice.
Ye Baba Sheri.
Yeah, what a logic! Woo! What could not exist in a closed, mixed economy? So a balance of trade deficit. I mean, if you're closed, then how will you have a trade deficit? How will you... So like this, budget deficit can happen depending on spending and revenue. National debt could be there depending on how you borrow. You could still borrow. The government could still borrow to finance its expenditure. It's still a mixed economy. Household debt can happen anyways. So it will be A. What does the accelerator principle state? And I believe this stated that as national income in, well, let me write that a better way. If national income increases, this also increases investments in the economy. Is that what it states?
Yes.
So yeah, and we can kind of like skip to it. How investment is a function of the rate of change of income. And if you look at other options, it doesn't have anything to do with consumption. It goes from income to investments, not investments to income. Investments to income, to national income, would be your multiplier, not your accelerator. And it deals with the induced form of investments, where investments are a function of income, not the autonomous form of investments. In the investment that comes about through changes in interest is the autonomous form. The induced form is what the accelerator talks about. What would... Okay, Bilal, okay, nice. What would not be classified as structural unemployment? And because Bilal is so cool, Bilal will explain to us what is structural unemployment.
यार तुम इतना मेरे ऊपर स्पॉटलाइट लाते हो ना, मेरी फट जाती है. Well, I think इसका एग्जांपल होता है ना, जब a skill goes out of like use, basically typewriters वाले लोग, समझ रहे हो यार?
So basically, because the economy is undergoing structural changes, because of that, as you know, the time period by which workers will retrain and go to other jobs and so on, due to those structural changes, basically you have some unemployment. So a car worker who is replaced by a robot on the production line, what do you guys say about this? Is this structural unemployment?
Makes much more sense.
But we have to look at which is not classified as structural unemployment.
Not. Oh.
So let's
A,
come.
A is structural
Okay, why is A structural?
because इसकी skills perhaps अगर पुराने इसमें देखते हैं आप, let's say 70s वगैरह में there used to be people who used to manufacture cars ना, अब it's more about robots, so those people are not employed anymore.
Okay, so because the economy hence went under there was some structural change, and now the skills of these workers are no longer required. They have to retrain and do something else. Okay, a coal miner whose mine closes because of increased use of solar power. So again, a change. So his particular skills are not appropriate anymore. A fruit picker who cannot find work in winter months. I believe this is your answer, because I believe this is the form of seasonal unemployment, where basically your employment is, I mean, it exists for for some part of your calendar year, not entirely. It's not like the fruit picker skills are not needed anymore. They're just not needed for these specific months. They will be needed next year. So that's how it's different from structural. A textile worker whose factory closes as production moves abroad. This can also be classified as structural because again, the economy is undergoing change. Factories are moving abroad, so hence because of that. 25. What represents a leakage from the circular flow of income? So in the four sector economy, leakages were savings, taxation, and import expenditure. So a balance of trade surplus, um, well, balance of trade surplus means revenue minus expenditure, and revenue is greater than expenditure. And this is normally tax revenue. So can we say this is a leakage? Okay, because again, if it's a surplus, revenue is greater than expenditure, and this is mainly tax revenue. So that's leakage. A, oh, sorry. This is a balance of trade. What am I saying? Uh, it, I didn't read it. Okay, it happens. It happens. Okay.
सोचो मैंने पता नहीं शायद मेरी कोई इकोनॉमिक्स खराब हो गई.
So
Economics already खराब है शेरी, तुम्हारी इस वजह से नहीं तुम कंफ्यूज हो.
well,
तुम्हारे कितना यूज है?
well, good to see you guys had the confidence to correct me. But anyways, so balance of trade surplus is export revenue minus import expenditure. Uh, this happens if exports revenue goes up and import expenditure like goes down, or either one of the two. So obviously this is an injection. It is not a leakage because import expenditure is going down. A government budget surplus would be exactly what I was saying, because that's tax revenue minus government expenditure. So for budget surplus, the tax revenue should go up, um, or so like hence that could be a leakage. A reduction in funds for research and development, that is basically a reduction in well, this would reduce investment expenditure. So this is investments go down, which means your injections go down. It doesn't have anything to do with leakages. Reinvestment of a firm's profits again do not meet your metric of leakages. So because they go back inside the firm, right? So it stays within the circular flow. It doesn't leak. 26. What will cause a downward shift in the aggregate demand curve of an economy? So what will decrease the aggregate demand curve? Because like this, I believe, would be a downward shift. A leftward shift would be a downward shift, which is a decrease. So an increase in firms' stock of raw materials. I don't see how that would affect your aggregate demand curve. Like, I don't see. Yeah, and again, it also would then depend. I mean, if they have more raw materials, so what? How does it affect your aggregate demand curve? It should be C plus. My stylus is acting up. C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? So anything that links to this. A decrease in the exports of goods, I believe that could. A decrease because export revenue if it goes down. A decrease in the propensity to import. If you're importing less, then AD will go up. AD won't go down. A decrease in saving. If you're now that's interesting though. If you decrease savings, can we say that consumption will automatically go up?
Uh,
So now we are conflicted between B and D.
नो कंजम्पशन बढ़ेगी तो एडी बढ़ेगा ना, ऐसे उसने बोले एडी कम होगा.
Oh, yeah, sorry, silly mistake, it's okay.
You're really tired right now.
It's as long as you don't get any questions wrong, we're fine. Which policy is most likely to raise the level of total demand in an economy? Total demand is again by definition aggregate demand. So here it's raising, here it's increasing. Anyways, an increase in indirect taxation matched by a reduction in indirect taxation. Now, if you increase direct taxation, what would that do? That would decrease your disposable income should go down, and hence your consumption should go down. So that really won't help your aggregate demand. Even if you reduce indirect taxes, if they're both matched, that might keeps consumption on the same level, but it won't. It would definitely not increase total demand. That's for sure. It would either reduce consumption or keep it on the more or less the same level. Now, if you relax import controls, that means the people will import more, and that would reduce AD. So, what were we saying? A and D are out. Cuts in public expenditure matched by tax cuts. So cuts in public expenditure means government spending goes down, which should normally decrease AD, but here it said it's matched by tax cuts, that your tax rate goes down by a similar a matched amount. This is like your balanced budget multiplier, if you remember that.
and reverse multiplier में थोड़ा सा भी like a mild मतलब contraction effect तो पड़ेगा ही.
Yeah. So the idea is, because your tax multiplier, let's call it T, I don't know how you usually denote it, it is smaller than your expenditure multiplier, which is K. So when you're going downwards, let's say your economy, but understand, if the spending decreases, AD decreases, and if tax rate decreases, then AD increases. However, the increase in AD would be by a less amount, by a small amount. Let's say it's like by let's say this is like by 1.5. However, the decrease in AD would be something like by 2.5. Just giving you examples, because the idea is that your expenditure multiplier is always going to be larger than your tax multiplier. So it would still have an overall contractionary effect, leaving you with D. Devaluation of the currency. What does devaluation of the currency do? It reduces export prices, making exports more competitive. So export revenue should increase because they sell a lot, and it increases import prices, making imports more expensive, and import expenditure should decrease. Now, if you remember, this only happens in the case of the Marshall-Lerner condition, where your exports and your imports are relatively elastic. But definitely, they've asked which policy is most likely. It's definitely more likely than the other three, because D works in the cases where such products are elastic. A, B, and C never work. So that's the idea. The government cuts taxes. Okay, so taxes go down and increases spending in order to create jobs during a recession. So both are expansionary policies. When will a resulting budget deficit be least likely to cause a permanent reduction in unemployment? So basically, when will this policy, which is basically cutting taxes and increasing spending, which is the same thing as saying budgeting for a deficit, when will this policy be least likely to work with regards to permanently reducing unemployment? So when households expect higher inflation rates in the future, well, normally when households expect higher inflation rates in the future, they bring forward their spending, because they're like, it's cheap now, it'll be even higher later on, even more expensive. So normally in such cases, consumption goes up in the short run. Um, so like that should perhaps help you with creating jobs. I don't know how that should. So I believe that should help you with in creating jobs. When households spend their extra disposable income on domestic products, if they're spending on domestic products, again that should help you create jobs. When the government's extra spending is on new infrastructure products, well, if it's on infrastructure products, then obviously in the long run, permanent unemployment is likely to go down, because then you would have jobs, to maybe not now, but definitely in the long run. So so there that would result in a reduction in unemployment. When the government's extra spending is on the salaries of public sector workers, okay, so I believe now this is interesting because you want to have a permanent reduction in unemployment, and now if you're just spending on public sector workers on the salaries, uh, you might be spending now because you have a budget deficit, but later on when you do not want to budget for a deficit, when you can't sustain this amount of spending, you won't have those workers, because obviously, as whenever till the point you can continue spending, these guys have jobs. When you stop spending, these guys don't have jobs, because that's you're paying for them, your government expenditure is paying for them. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
It does.
In 2011, the global money supply, narrowly defined. Do we remember the definition of narrow money? What was narrow money?
Nairo money M1 now.
Not a store
Medium
of
of
value.
exchange.
Maybe
So
one at a time.
it's
Medium
only
of exchange होता है ना M1.
So the money that basically just acts as a medium of exchange,
Hmm.
or M1, whatever, um, mechanics, anyways. So it rose 11%, and broadly defined money, so which is basically narrow money, plus that money that acts as a store of value. Shaya, do you have any examples for to help us distinguish between the two?
यार the basic idea है वैसे तो simply if you want to distinguish इसके monitors और themes वाला simple वो ideology, but अगर थोड़ा सा ज़्यादा consider करना है, so you can talk about how cash might act as a better medium of exchange, and it can store value as well, but at the same time अगर तुम बोलो let's say something as gold ना, it does store a value but it does not act as a medium of exchange as well. So नहीं एक मिनट वेट मैं उल्टा वाला बता दिया
Uh,
पैर
no, so gold would fall inside broadly defined money, but not inside narrowly defined money. Is that what you're saying?
हाँ
So
हाँ
gold, savings accounts, all those type of things fall inside broadly defined money. Anyhow, but let's still read what the question is asking. So this narrowly defined money increased by 11%, broadly increased by roughly 8%, as central banks continued their efforts to keep interest rates low. Um, so when money supply increases, interest rates follow an inverse relationship, so they decrease. And in fact, we didn't have to do all that behest, because all they're asking is what type of policy does this statement illustrate, which is an
exactly
expansionary monetary policy. Because when interest rates are low, then obviously the opportunity cost of consumption is low, because instead of saving, you might as well consume. So that is expansionary. This also increases investments, because it's just much easier to borrow, to take loans on lower rates of interest and invest, which increases aggregate demand. So it's an expansionary, not fiscal. This is a monetary policy. Which policy measure would be most likely to reduce a developing country's birth rate and its household savings ratio? So by the household savings ratio, we mean the degree it saves, the amount it saves to the amount it spends, or something of that sort. So like if you're reducing the saving ratio, can we say you're basically reducing savings? Do you guys agree with that?
Uh,
Anyways, so to reduce a developing country's economy's birth rate, how do you reduce its birth rate? Uh,
Education
educate,
से तो करते हैं.
educate them
I mean, if you
on their
increase,
sector.
if you increase, well, yeah, okay, sure, yeah, but if you increase student tuition fees, then most likely less people will. Now, one way to look at this is that like less people will go and educate themselves in the first place. Another way to look at this is now people will be like, let's have less kids because we'll have to pay more for them. And obviously if they're paying for student tuition, then a lot of their money would go as payment, not as savings. But I don't know, this is a weird option. Let's look at the rest anyways. A relaxation of immigration controls. I don't see how immigration controls have anything to do with birth rates. um,
वैसे हो सकता है.
I mean,
देखो, if USA relaxes their immigration controls, तो पाकिस्तानी जाते हैं वहाँ पे करके आए हैं visas and passports.
यार ये
let's
तो
just ignore that. The introduction of a basic state pension. So if you have a basic state pension, then you're more likely, if you have more money because you have some amount of pension, then wouldn't you be more likely to be like, okay, I can afford more kids now rather than I should have less kids. So maybe it's not C. The removal of tariffs on imported foodstuffs.
यार
इससे
ऐसे
consumption.
ऐसे
Yes,
ऐसे
yes.
कैन यू थिंक अबाउट इट दिस वे कि जब लोगों के पास पैसे हैं तो दे कैन एक्चुअली अफोर्ड इट लाइक cuz उसने डेवलपिंग कहा ना तो पीपल कैन एक्चुअली अफोर्ड एजुकेशन एंड लाइक गेट एजुकेटेड एंड लाइक नॉट हैव किड्स इन द फ्यूचर मतलब
In part
maybe
C.
yeah.
Okay, but then how does that reduce the household's saving ratio? Maybe if their savings remain constant, but their income includes pension, maybe that reduces the ratio.
Maybe.
So weird question. So let's keep this as an option then. The removal of tariffs on imported foodstuff. I mean, if foodstuff is cheaper now, then I, well, then you're probably gonna be like, okay, I can have kids because I can feed them. Like, so we're left with A and C. Now they're both very problematic options, to be honest. But like A,
A makes more sense.
yeah, I would say A makes more sense as well. C is a bit of a stretch because if you have more money, it's unlikely that you the first thing you do with that money is go and educate yourself. I mean, um, so maybe not. So let's stick with A. With sticking with the logic that if it's more expensive to pay for your kids' education, you would hopefully, I don't know, you can literally tell a white guy made this paper because like I I mean like because the logic, perhaps the logic here is like if it's more expensive to pay for your kids' education, you'll have less kids, and obviously if you'll be paying a lot for the education, you'll be saving less because you have a fixed disposable income, right? And then let's quickly check our answers. Okay, so we checked our answers and not the best. So we got 2 wrong in this 10-mark question interval. So the first we got wrong was obviously question 30. Really didn't like it. Anyhow, so the correct answer was C. I'll tell you why A was wrong first before I go to why C is right. The reason why A was wrong and the reason why our explanation doesn't cut it is because we miss the reality of a developing country. So the reality of a developing country is something we did touch upon before, but like we needed to take that into account more. Was that if your tuition fees have increased, you're just less likely to get education in the first place. And if you're getting less education, then obviously you're probably gonna have a high birth rate rather than a low birth rate because if more education normally leads to a reduction in the birth rate. So which is why a there's less education, so you probably wouldn't be able to reduce your birth rate. But if you look at C now, so C, if you think about this, if you have basic state pension, so you can um, afford education. More people can afford education, and to look at programs and awareness programs and stuff of that sort. So if you can afford education, your birth rate should decrease. The only issue we have with this is how your savings ratio decreases. Now remember, your savings ratio is the proportion of your income that you save. So it's basically your savings upon your total income. Now think of it like this. Let's in one case, I'll explain this through two cases. So in the first case, let's say with an introduction in basic state pension, we're not too sure what happens to savings, and that's fine. We aren't given any particular information about savings here. So let's just say your savings remain more or less constant. But what we do know, your income would increase, right? Because you have pensions coming in. So if your denominator increases, the overall fraction goes down. So your ratio goes down, even if your savings are the same, because your income has increased. So the proportion of income spent on savings would decrease. Another way to explain this is that normally lower income groups have high MPCs. They save less, they spend more because their income is just so low, that they have to spend like almost all of it to fulfill their basic necessities. If their income increases, well, now they can spend on basic necessities and think of other stuff. So if your income increases now, if you're not just strapped for cash all the time, only then will you think of saving. So you might save a bit, and hence that would increase. That was sorry. So that would what do you say? Increase your saving ratio. So that was the issue we were having, rather. My bad. But the issue here is that you have to decrease the savings ratio. So again, you have to refer to this particular concept. I don't know why I told this, but like, yeah. Because again, a state pension is not going to drastically change your income level. It's not going to drastically take you from lower income level to higher income level, because that was an issue that we were having. That we were thinking that normally lower income groups, they save less, but higher income groups they save more. But again, the issue with this question is you don't know what will happen to savings. You can't really make a statement on that particularly. But you can say that income will increase, so your savings ratio overall will decrease. So like, not this basically. Very painful question. Anyhow, that gives you C as your right answer. Correcting that. What else did we get wrong? Yeah, we got this wrong. So this was in fact A. And I just keep B and C crossed out because like that's kind of because B and C are obviously wrong, and we were close to A. We did say that okay, if you spend and if they expect higher inflation rates, they'll bring the consumption forward, and it will reduce unemployment, and we were right. It will reduce unemployment. However, it won't cause a permanent reduction in unemployment. Why is that? Because think of the Phillips curve. Think of in fact the expectations augmented Phillips curve. Let's take this as your percentage unemployment, and let's take this as your percentage price level. This is your Phillips curve. Now, when the government implements an expansionary policy, which is basically what a budget deficit is, let's say you move from this level of unemployment to here. So your unemployment rate does decrease. However, this is just temporary. And the reason for that is because due to adjusted expectations. And again, expectations of higher inflation rates in the future are exactly the type of adjusted expectations that we're talking about. Because if even the idea here is that households, if they feel that even though even though like unemployment rates has gone down now, and inflation rates have gone up now, if they believe that inflation rates will remain higher, that kind of adjusts your Phillips curve. So you move to this one. So then what do you get? You get something known as somewhat stagflation rather. So you still have a higher level of inflation rate. You still have an increase in the price level, but what you go back to the same percentage of unemployment because of an adjustment in expectations. Remember, increase in aggregate demand used to move you upwards on the Phillips curve. However, that was temporary, and if expectations shift the Phillips curve altogether, well, then you're back to where you started. So that's the reason why it will be A, because this is the least likely condition where you will be able to cause a permanent reduction because of expectations. Now, with D, again, D is not wrong itself per se, but again, you need to think about the least likely condition. So when government's extra spending is on salaries of public sector workers, uh, admittedly, the extra spending might not reduce unemployment in the long run, but the policy is twofold: extra spending and obviously cut in taxes. Even if you don't spend more, if you just cut taxes, that should also increase aggregate demand. That should also decrease unemployment. So even if the extra spending is on something as temporary as just you just paying the salaries, you're not putting it into investment projects, for let's say, cutting taxes should be expansionary enough, and just that alone should be able to reduce unemployment. So here you can still have some level of permanent reduction, but in A, when you have expectations changing, there it's a huge chance that you'll just return back to the point where you were at a higher price level, but at the same rate, at the same level of employment. And that would be it for this paper. And hopefully that helped.